Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show with UK Health Radio, your fun global network for natural healing. Today, we are going to be learning about breathing. My name is Catherine Carrigan. I am a medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author, and host of the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. Our guest today is Petri Berndtson, who's a philosopher of breathing in Helsinki, Finland. You can find out more about me and my work as a medical intuitive healer and about my books at catherinecarrigan.com. And while you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, you can find out more about Petri Berndtson's wonderful work on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, and all you have to do is put in the word mindfulness. So Petri Berndtson, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy that you invited me to your show.
Now, Petri Berndtson, who are you and what is your background? I understand you're a philosopher of breathing. What does that mean?
What does philosophy of breathing mean and what's my background? Well, my background is in philosophy. I studied philosophy first in University of Helsinki in Finland. I did my master thesis there already about the question of breath. And after that, and during that time and after I was teaching in philosophy as a lecturer at University of Lahti Applied Sciences, which is a city 100 kilometers from Helsinki. Lahti, there I was teaching many years philosophy for all students who studied different topics. They were not philosophy students at all. They were studying healthcare and economics and sports and technical topics and so on. So everybody had to study philosophy there. So I was teaching them their introduction to philosophy and business ethics and other kind of ethics courses. And then I had a chance when I already had done my master thesis, which I wrote in Finnish language. I was teaching also some breathing philosophy courses to some students who applied for those voluntary courses. And then later, in the end of my master thesis, I understood that I have found out something about breath that I had never seen written, at least in that kind of form, in any books on philosophy, Eastern or Western philosophy. So that gave me the strong feeling that I need to also write and do a PhD on this topic. And so I started my PhD studies in London, in a school called London Consortium, and then I left from there and I continued my studies in University of Jyväskylä, which is like in middle of Finland, and I did my PhD there, and I defended my PhD thesis on phenomenological ontology of breathing last September, and that went very well. And then I have also been a lecturer in Trondheim, in Norway, teaching architect and art students in breathing philosophy also. So I have been doing quite a lot of breathing philosophy. But what is it?
Okay, so Petri Berndtson, you and I have something in common in that we're both authors of books about breathing. My book, The Little Book of Breathwork, is my 7th Amazon #1 bestseller. And you published a book called Atmospheres of Breathing. So I taught yoga for 24 years. You have here's my book right behind us right here.
It's framed.
Yes, framed here. The Little Book of Breathwork. So, okay, so let's talk about healing and the connection to breathing. So in my book, The Little Book of Breathwork, I talk about the 10 principles of enlightened breathing. right?
Yes.
And I like to put things, I don't have a PhD in breathing, but I like to put things in terms that everyone can understand. I've taught yoga for 24 years now. I'm 60. So I like to use regular terms so that people can understand. In your view, Petri Berndtson, what is the connection between healing and our breath?
Well, this is a very important question, but then we need to understand that, of course, health can mean so many different kind of things. So we, of course, talk about mental health, physical health, even spiritual health. And then I would like to connect this question of health with the word health etymologically is deeply connected with wholeness and holiness, or holy, health, and whole. And these are in an important way connected with the question of breath. So how breath is connected with all these questions is that the breath itself connects us with the world. It makes us connected and with the world, and we find our wholeness with the breath, because our wholeness, we are part of this world. We are part of this big atmosphere of air, and we are connected with other people who are also breathing beings. So in the fundamental sense, I would say that our health in all kinds of levels is connected to this, how we find our, as a partial beings, how we found our wholeness in the wholeness of the world and wholeness of this world which we share with other people. So I would start to think of the whole question of health from that perspective, and how the breath is then in an incredibly important way connected with this wholeness question. And then the holiness, because I myself read religious texts. For example, Jesus' Holy Spirit, I read it, that it actually means holy breath. So all these questions are in some way connected.
Now, in my book, The Little Book of Breathwork, again, I talk about the 10 principles of enlightened breathing. And one of the things that I point out to everyone is, in any given moment, like if you're listening to this broadcast, like right now, you can tell how stressed you are by simply tuning into your breath. If you're breathing into your upper chest, you're basically locked in your sympathetic nervous system, where you're producing stress hormones. And if you can breathe all the way down into your belly using your full lung capacity and breathing into your belly, you're also accessing the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the side of the nervous system that allows you to relax. And although it's so simple to look at how am I breathing, when you get to this fundamental question, your breath literally determines the quality of your existence. And I notice, even for myself, having taught yoga all these years, I can tell at any time. For example, this morning I was driving through rush hour traffic, and I tuned in and I noticed my breath was a little bit shallow. But at the same time, you can overcome many serious diseases with your breath. And I myself, when I was 30 years old, which was 30 years ago, I was diagnosed with asthma. I had to use inhalers and so on. And by learning how to breathe, I overcame that. And no doctor can find any trace of asthma. And as a medical intuitive healer, I teach breathing exercises to all my clients who suffer from anxiety and high blood pressure and insomnia and sleep apnea. So Petri Berndtson, from your experience working with what I refer to as actual humans, what sort of diseases or illnesses or challenges have you seen people overcome by learning to breathe properly and by incorporating breath work into their self-care routines?
Well, as a philosopher of breathing, of course, the question of this kind of health is not my number one topic of what I study in breathing, because the questions that I studied in breathing are then questions connected with ethics and connected with religion and connected with questions of peace and questions of hospitality and ontology and questions of being in general and our relation with the world and how we study the question of world and our relation with other people through breath. So these are my expertise questions. So the question of health itself is not the number one question at all in what I study in breath. But of course, I have myself, for 10 years, I have been doing a Zen meditation where I sit pretty much every day and I just go deeper and deeper into the breath. And of course, there you notice how the breath itself relaxes you little by little. It expands you little by little. You start to feel that you are connected with this world. And then what happens is that you start to feel in a certain way that the world takes care of you. The atmosphere of air around you is kind of, if we are talking in the healthcare way, is there is some kind of like, it's like some kind of non-personal nurse or a doctor or a guide or a teacher, master, you can call it in many ways, and it is serving all these different purposes. And then of course, when you, with every breath, the deeper it gets, the more deeply it massages your internal organs, and it starts to relax you from inside. And of course, this is, and it, with every breath, it relaxes your heart. With every breath, it relaxes your belly. And of course, the belly is called the second brain, and many of the chemicals that are going through in our brain, they are produced actually in our belly, and so on. So it has plenty of this kind of dimensions.
Right. So I know in my book, The Little Book of Breathwork, I tell the story of a client who came to me. He had high blood pressure to the point where his kidneys had failed, and he had to get up every morning at 4 a.m. to drive to a dialysis center to receive treatment for his failing kidneys. So his blood pressure was out of control. His kidneys were failing. He was only in his mid-30s. And I do all my work as a medical intuitive healer prayerfully. And I tuned in and I knew that I needed to teach him breath work so that he would have some tools to use at 4 a.m. and tools to use when he was strapped to the dialysis center. And again, even though he was on 3 different medications, his blood pressure was out of control. So I started by creating videos that anyone can see for free on one of my 2 websites. If you go to Unlimited Energy Now, you'll find those videos for free. You'll also find them on my YouTube channel. And it's a routine that I call 8 minutes to inner peace. And I started putting those videos together and explaining this to people. I included that breathwork routine in my book, Unlimited Energy Now, which is about how to have more energy, because when you breathe more deeply, you have more energy. And I go into great detail in my book, The Little Book of Breathwork. So again, I've seen people even lose weight by learning how to breathe. One of my clients, one of my yoga students actually, she only came to yoga class once a week, but she understood what I was seeing, that when we are constantly producing stress hormones, especially the stress hormone cortisol, it changes the way that your body utilizes sugar and the way that you store fat. So she started doing breath work all day long, every day. So consciously breathing deeply. And by doing that, she lost 22 pounds. Coming to yoga class only once a week and doing deep breathing all day long. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself. Now, Petri Berndtson, you have developed a philosophy of breathing. What is your philosophy of breathing?
Well, we first need to ask, what is philosophy? What do we mean by philosophy? philosophy in ancient Greek, as a word, Greek word, it means love of wisdom. And many in the academic philosophy often forget and don't use it in this kind of original meaning of love of wisdom. So then I take this very seriously, that philosophy is love of wisdom. So then philosophy of breathing would mean, the love of wisdom of the breath. So that there is the breath as an experiential question, how we experience breath each and every moment. The breath itself is wise, it has wisdom. And the philosopher or a human being in general, if they start to connect in this kind of philosophical way, they start to love this wisdom of the breath and take this, and if it's wise, it has wisdom, this breath, they take this breath itself as their teacher, or if we want to use the Indian word guru, or a guide, so that the breath itself becomes our guide. And the philosopher, as a philosopher of breath, becomes kind of like a student who wants to, and the student, of course, is the one who listens. The student isn't the one who first tells his or her theories and teaches, but becomes the student who listens and makes questions. And that's another level of what philosophy is. It's questioning. It's becoming as questionful as possible. And then questioning means here to become as open as possible, because the person who truly asks questions is one who doesn't yet know, who wants to learn, and is as open as possible to learn as much as possible. So, and then that is connected with the attitude of wonder. And it's often also said in ancient philosophy, for example, Plato and Aristotle both said that the beginning of philosophy is wonder. So there comes connected this question of love, question of this attitude of questioning, and this wondering. So philosophy of breathing is to learn to wonder, love, and question in a new way this experience of breath, which is all the time happening in us and between us and so on, and truly try to become as carefully listening and learning as possible. This I would call what philosophy of breathing is, one way to explain what it means.
Petri Berndtson, I just really love your philosophy of breathing. So I'm going to share my philosophy of breathing that's developed after 24 years of teaching yoga and teaching people how to breathe. I talk about, in my book, The Little Book of Breathwork, I talk about the 10 principles of enlightened breathwork. So the first one is inhale, is paying attention to inhaling, and also really consciously, as you say, being aware of what you're inhaling. Inhaling peace, joy, vitality, abundance, oneness, connectedness. The second principle I see of enlightened breathwork is actually exhale. And think about what you're exhaling, because when you exhale, you let go. So letting go stress and tension, anger, resentment, bitterness, sadness, grief, low self-esteem. The third principle that I see of enlightened breathwork is breathing in a circle. When you breathe in a circle, you balance the sympathetic and parasympathetic sides of your nervous system. You're literally balancing your nervous system at a very super deep level. And when you breathe in a circle, this circular breathing, you actually feel happy. It's one of the quickest, fastest ways to get to joy. So if you're experiencing depression, if you learn to practice circular breathing, you can experience this joy right now. The fourth principle of enlightened breathwork is to relax, because when you relax, you're able to take in more oxygen, more energy, more chi. And I totally agree with you, Petri Berndtson, that our breath has its own intelligence. So your breath is your life force, and it absolutely has its own intelligence. The fifth principle of enlightened breath work is energize, which is about really consciously using your breath to draw healing energy into your body. When you're more full of energy, as I talk about in my book, Unlimited Energy Now, it's easier to do everything that your soul is here to do. The sixth principle of enlightened breath work is to awaken your awareness. So as we breathe with great consciousness, you become more aware, as Petri says, of your connection to all that is, the planet, other living beings, other humans, even spirituals, forces, the angels, God, and your deep divine love. The seventh principle is to discover yourself, because when you breathe very consciously, you can become aware of what's really happening. And I feel, as a medical intuitive healer, this is so crucial because we live in a very numbed out society. People are drugging themselves legally and illegally. They're distracting themselves with social media and TV and all these other things rather than really tuning in. And in my work as a medical intuitive, I use my intuition at a professional level. And it's my experience that the word intuitive means in tune. And you have to be in tune with yourself before you can be in tune with the world around you. So as you breathe, you're really discovering, how am I really feeling? What's really going on? The eighth principle is to contain your experience. So I feel that the reason so many people are distracting themselves with drugs, legal, illegal, and activities and overworking and social media and so on, is that sometimes our emotions can feel so intense that they can feel overwhelming, or we can even feel afraid to feel how we feel. But when you breathe consciously, you can contain your experience by something as simple as saying, okay, I'm going to breathe consciously for 5 minutes or half an hour. You set a period of time to experience yourself, and then you go and do something else. The ninth principle is release, which is literally using your breath to let go. What can you let go of? You can use your breath to let go of pain. I remember several years ago, I had to have a minor surgery. It was done under local anesthetic. And I used my breath very consciously to release the pain. And then the final principle of enlightened breath work is to feel the bliss. Because as Petri Berndtson knows from his practice of Zen meditation, and I know in my practice of conscious breath work, when you breathe very consciously and you breathe through the emotions that have been disturbing your energy field and disturbing your mind, you can get to the place where you feel extremely happy and naturally calm and blissful. So I appreciate Petri's philosophy of breathing, and that's my little take on the principles of enlightened breathing. So Petri, you have a great deal of study on this subject. Do you have any suggestions or comments for our audience? Further thoughts?
Well, this is a very nice list of what your enlightened breathwork means, and I find many connections here to, for example, what Buddha was teaching, what also something what Jesus was teaching, what the Upanishadic tradition was teaching. So these many spiritual teachers and many people who have been dealing with the breath in yoga tradition and Buddhist tradition, and in many traditions, these are extremely important dimensions, and in mindfulness and so on. So definitely I see here like a wonderful list you have, I would say.
Now, Petri Berndtson, you have invented a notion of philosophical breath work. What exactly is philosophical breath work, and how does your system differ from other styles of breath work?
Well, I would say that in philosophical breath work, when I was saying that the philosophy means wonder of the world, and you are questioning, you don't know yet what the breath is. You're kind of like a student of breath. And in philosophy, it is even if you have learned something, and of course, you learn all the time things, and you have experiences, and you read, and so on. So you're learning all the time. But in philosophy, the important thing is to become again and again kind of like a childlike wanderer. Is like, even if I think I know these things now, then it is important in philosophical breath work, in philosophy itself, to put all these things aside, or put them in brackets, or kind of place them in abeyance, or make this kind of suspension of your knowledge. And then, because when you think that you already know, it easily happens that you become a little bit closed, because I know already these things, so I kind of don't have any more room for perhaps totally new experiences, or totally something which might be so surprising that it kind of like puts in question mark what I think I already know. So that's kind of like in philosophical breath work, the idea is that we can use any kind of breath work methods that other breath work traditions have. But the attitude is perhaps slightly different, because, for example, we have famous breathwork methods of holotropic breathwork, rebirthing breathwork, therapeutic breathwork, transformational breathwork, and so on. So when you read and listen what the teachers and inventors and practitioners of these breathwork methods are doing, normally already the name, how they have named the breathwork, is what is it emphasizing. So holotropic breathwork, for example, tries to find this kind of holotropic experiences, which then is connected with altered states of consciousness, or what they call non-ordinary states of consciousness. Or rebirthing breathwork tries to find certain kind of like a rebirth and even immortality, if we take Leonard Orr's words literally. Then in therapeutic breathwork, the name, it already says that it's certain kind of a therapeutic method of like that we have personal problems, or we are stressed, or anxious, or we have some other traumas, or so on. So we use this method for therapeutic purposes. And transformational breathwork then is also connected with this kind of self-healing, but it then emphasizes more like this kind of what this kind of self-transformation can be. And all of these breathworks are positive, and they can serve wonderful things for a person, and give huge breakthroughs, and make person understand themselves better, and so on. So that's not at all, but the difference is where philosophical breathwork is that philosophical breathwork doesn't start with certain kind of like a purpose of I want to heal myself. This can happen, and of course these kind of things happen, they are wonderful. Or I want to find non-ordinary states of consciousness, and so on, or find some kind of rebirth or anything like this. But it is more like that I come as a student, what the breath itself can teach me, and I'm open for anything. And it's not, and then there is also this kind of, often we have this kind of duality of the world and the self, and we are very often in breath work emphasizing the self, that I am looking for and discovering myself. But the important thing with the breath is that breath goes all the time in both directions. We have the in-breath and we have the out-breath, and there is only breath when there is this cycle of succession of in, going out. So in the same time, the breath itself is not only studying or learning about ourselves, but it is also learning about the world. And the world, as it is like when we breathe in the atmosphere of air, the world outside comes into us. So we can study what the kind of the world is doing in us. What happens when the world, the air comes into us, and does it have some kind of intelligence, as you were saying, or what can it teach us? For example, I'm very fascinated by a French philosopher, Gaston Bachelard. In my PhD, which also people can download for free in internet if they Google phenomenological ontology of breathing, they can get this, my PhD. And one of the most important philosophers in this, my PhD, was this Gaston Bachelard. And this Bachelard is talking about the imagination of air. And he's talking about the poets of air. And he divides poets to 4 different poets according to the element that they are most close to. So there are the poets of air, and there are poets of fire and water and earth. And in my PhD, then I connect with these poets of the air, and it is like the poets of the air, the similar way, become like students and open to this wisdom of the air. And Bachelard is talking about that there is certain kind of imagination. The air comes to us, within us, and starts to imagine itself, starts to dream within ourselves. And so the dreams that are happening to us while we are like daydreams, or also the dreams during the night, there is a possibility that these dreams or these visions or these images are made by or created by the air. When the breath, with the breath, the air comes and inspires us. And of course, this word inspiration is important, because we talk about artistic inspiration or inspiration in our lives, but it's important to remember that etymologically this word inspiration means to breathe in. So this air, this powerful life force air, comes within us and starts to dream within us. And then the poet of the air, or what he calls the aerial poet's task, is to start to listen that dreaming and put that dreaming into words, and then create that kind of aerial poetry. So, for example, this kind of things it could mean, what it means to become like a philosophical breath worker, is that, for example, not other forms of breath work are talking about this kind of like aerial poetry, at least to my knowledge. And so to become as open for all kinds of different possibilities that this air could teach us. Also, what kind of spatiality the air and breathing can teach us. What kind of, maybe we learn a totally new kind of concept of time, because of course time and rhythm is so deeply connected with the breath, because first of all, there is the succession of time, because the in-breath and the out-breath can't happen at the same time. So there is always before and after, and so on, and then it creates certain kind of rhythm, and that can, when we go deeper and deeper, that starts to perhaps create a totally new rhythm to our own life. If we would, for example, forget that there is the rhythm or the time of the clock in our wrist or in our mobile phone, and people are expecting us to live in a certain kind of this kind of objective time. But perhaps there is some kind of like a new concept of time which we could learn by listening to our breath and connect with other people. And what would that kind of time be? Or for example, that we are sharing this air together with the breath. What kind of new concept of communion it could create, or like a society, if we would take the breath and air as our teachers of building what it means to live together. So there are huge amount of different kind of possibilities. Also the whole way of thinking, what kind of way, perhaps new way of thinking the breath And the air could teach us if we would listen with every time when we are thinking or saying something. How is this connected with the breath? And how is this breath actually making it possible that we can share ideas and talk with each other, that it's kind of like just a dialect or a kind of one of the possibilities of breath is our speaking. So there is huge amount of possibilities.
Now, Petri Berndtson, we in natural healing understand the power of positive thinking. And by positive thinking, that means literally thinking positive thoughts, using affirmations. In my book, The Little Book of Breathwork, I include directions not only for breathing exercises, but also hand mudras that anybody can do in order to change the frequencies in their body to direct the energy. And as well, I also include affirmations. And affirmation, another word for it, is simply a mantra. So lots of people have trouble meditating. They have trouble turning their mind off, their thoughts off. But if you incorporate affirmations, mudra, and breathing, you can shift out of this overthinking state. So Petri Berndtson, your experience, how important is it, do you think, for us to stop thinking? As you point out, Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras defines yoga as the cessation of the mind. How important is it to stop thinking, and how can we use breathing exercises to achieve this quiet mind?
How important it is to learn to stop thinking? Well, here as a philosopher, because of course philosophy is often understood as a practice of thinking, practice of questioning thinking. So we need to understand that there are these kind of like, we have so many different kind of concepts of thinking and what thinking actually means. We have this, as you mentioned, positive thinking, and then Patanjali and other spiritual practices emphasize the possibility and perhaps the importance of stop thinking, or it is what we would call overthinking, which we might understand that it stresses us and too many things in our heads and so on. Here it is important now to understand that there is so many different kind of ways that we can understand thinking. For example, Japanese people talk about to think with the hara, to think with the belly, which then is completely different kind of way of connecting with the question of thinking, because that's then kind of starting to, that the thinking itself becomes a certain kind of meditative practice, that it is not anymore this kind of like overthinking of thinking like in mathematics or calculating things or trying to solve problems with our theories and ready-made concepts and so on. So there are different kind of ways of understanding thinking. So for example, this thinking with the belly or thinking with hara, we could understand this as a certain kind of meditative way of thinking. And perhaps then this can be even sometimes equal with what then Patanjali might understand of this kind of stopping of the mind, or at least slowing the mind. But then in another way, when I mentioned this Bachelard just a moment ago with the poets of the air, then we could also understand that when I talked about this imagination of the air, that itself, it is the air that starts to imagine and dreams within us. We could also talk about perhaps that it is not anymore us who are thinking this kind of overthinking, but it is, if we start to listen the air, it is the air which thinks itself within us. So it's not anymore this kind of personal way of thinking, but perhaps gives us totally different kind of perspective of what does it mean to think, and that then, and then there is another way of understanding the question of thinking, which is that very often people forget that the word thinking or to think is etymologically connected with thankfulness, to thank. It is also in German language, denken and danken. And in English language, to think, to thank. That actually the question of thinking becomes thanking. That it is, if you find, for example, this kind of different way of approaching the world, you find this kind of like, if you learn to think with the breath, then it becomes like this kind of like, and the breath itself, it's more, the thinking becomes more like listening and more like thankfulness, that you are thanking and becoming aware of this amazing power of breath, or the mystery of breath, that you are connected all the time, and that makes it possible that we can communicate and speak with each other, and how we share the air together. So then this thinking becomes actually this kind of thankfulness and gratefulness, which then is totally different kind of way of understanding thinking, and that also then starts to like, it gives completely different kind of quality to our thinking. Then I want to also point out this kind of, when you mentioned the positive thinking, for example, in this kind of way, we often say that the positive in positive thinking, we have a glass, which is then, if there is a half amount of liquid in the glass, and the people who are positive thinkers, they say it's a half full, and who are negative thinkers, they might say it's a half empty. But I would say that perhaps even this we could see in a totally different way, because maybe the more empty the glass is from the perspective of breathing, that's of course wonderful, because now the glass is full of air, which is the fullness of air. So then we need to kind of, make this kind of gestalt shifts. We need to shift our attitude and our perspective, and then all these kind of questions of thinking, and perhaps stop thinking, and this kind of, they might start to get different kind of meanings. And this is also part of philosophical breath work, in the sense that then these meanings of the breath, and how we experience breath, and how we think with the breath, and how we imagine with breath, how we talk with the breath, and how we breathe together, these might start to get completely new kind of meanings. And then we also can start to, when you talk about your philosophy of breathing, this list, which was wonderful itself, but then that might give you completely new ideas of, like, maybe your list might need something which you never thought of or experienced. So this is part of the philosophical breath work, and that I would also give and bring to these other forms of breath work, of therapeutic breath work, and the holotropic breath work, and transformative breath work, and so on. So, of like, even if they are wonderful and beautiful and working methods, so what kind of this, that we get back to this kind of attitude of wonder, what could that bring in a totally new way that might surprise us and become more like this kind of way of child attitude. And here it's important, like, to remember that, for example, Jesus said that only those who become like childlike wanderers again have the possibility of entering the kingdom of God. And in Taoism, Lao Tzu, for example, in Tao Te Ching, all the time speaks about return to child kind attitude. And here, important, what is huge wisdom in Chinese language, we have these masters, Lao Tzu and Zhuang Tzu or Kung Fu Tzu. This word Tzu means master, but originally it means child. So to become a child again after you have entered the knowledge of adult, and then be able to get back to that wisdom of the child, and to perhaps that soft breathing of the child, and learn from the breathing of the children, and start with your meditative practice and breath work, start to find that kind of soft baby or childlike breathing. And there is a possibility of starting to understand this kind of like what it could mean, that actually to become a master is to, at the same time, to become like a child, playful person. That breath work isn't anymore breath work, but it also has breath play in Very, and that, okay, this is last point, then I let you talk. Then this kind of part of the philosophical breath work and this love of the wisdom of the breath, I would say is important dimension is this playfulness and this joyfulness, as you mentioned yourself, joyfulness. But this playfulness is that in breath work, in different breath works, there are these different kind of methods that they are using. But we need to also get back to this, that we are not like slaves of these methods, that yes, this method will take me in a way to where I'm trying to get, but start to play with the breath, like find all kinds of different kinds of breath that maybe you have not ever before experienced, and maybe these new ways of breathing will teach you something, perhaps a new way to understand yourself, the world, others, and so on.
You've been listening to Petri Berndtson. Petri Berndtson and I are both authors of books about breathing. Petri's book is called Atmospheres of Breathing. My book is called The Little Book of Breathwork. And wherever you are, know that breathing and learning how to breathe playfully, fully, and with awareness and wonder is often your fastest route to natural healing. This is Catherine Carrigan. I'm the host of the Natural Healing Show. You can find out more about me and my work as a medical intuitive healer at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. You can find out more about Petri Berndtson and his work, which he calls mindfulness, on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks so much for listening. You're listening to the Natural Healing Show on UK Health Radio, your global feel-good radio. And remember, when you learn to breathe, you open your energy, you relax your nervous system, and you experience natural healing. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.